Hello, everyone. Well, I'm sorry about that mechanical failure. I don't know what happened, so I'm just going to add on to the original video where I was talking about A Rose for Emily and the interview that William Faulkner was giving about A Rose for Emily and how I think that Rose could be viewed from a symbolic perspective of perhaps the flower, or perhaps it can be viewed from a symbolic perspective from the color rose, or it could also be viewed as the past tense of the verb to rise. And the story is very much about an old Southern aristocracy that no longer exists now that slavery has been defeated. And Miss Emily is a relic from that old Southern aristocracy. And what that means is that the old ways of perhaps standing when an old Southern aristocrat would walk into a room, much like it happens in a courtroom when a judge walks in. Perhaps those old ways are no longer applicable. And one of the major themes in A Rose for Emily happens to be about death. And it's not just about the death of characters. I would suggest that more importantly, it's about the death of an old way of life, a life that no longer exists because it's based on Southern aristocracy. And the idea of Miss Emily clinging on to a dead past, I think, is very applicable from a symbolic perspective when she dates Homer Barron, who is supposed to represent a laborer and a northerner. So this would be very different from the old Southern aristocracy. And of course, when he's unwilling to commit to her, she decides to kill him. And that said, I know that the story can be very confusing when you're reading it. And the reason why it's confusing is because of the mixed chronology. We've got sections that are out of order, but if you were to put all of the sections in order, they would make perfect sense. Because basically, we're told how Miss Emily was a former Southern aristocrat with a domineering father who wouldn't allow her to date. And eventually, her father died, and she had great difficulty accepting his death. In fact, she held on to his corpse for 3 days. And eventually, she was able to release the corpse and go back out into society. And she began dating, of all people, Homer Barron, who was a northern laborer. So that led to the entire town to gossip. How could she demean herself by dating a northerner and also a laborer? And we're told a little bit about Homer, and we're told that he liked men. And I know that that line might suggest his sexual orientation. But regardless of his sexual orientation, what that line does tell us is that he's not going to commit to Miss Emily, even though he's dating her. So the assumption is that once he disappears, and again, when you put all of the elements of the story in place, it makes perfect sense. Because after we're told that Homer was a man's man, so to speak, and was not the marrying kind, we know that Miss Emily goes to a druggist and buys arsenic, refuses to indicate why she's buying the arsenic. The druggist is too intimidated to approach her or to confront her, so he sells her the arsenic and writes for rats, which I think is a wonderful wink and a nod, because one could say that Homer is the kind of rat because he won't commit to her even though he's having a relationship with her. And then Homer is seen entering her home and is never seen again. And then there's a smell that emanates from her home, and the town feels uncomfortable again confronting Miss Emily. So they spread lime to basically cover up the smell. And Miss Emily becomes a recluse. We're told how she tries a few things like trying to teach China painting lessons, but those aren't successful because those aren't popular anymore because there's a new generation in town. And we're also told throughout the story that insanity runs in Miss Emily's family and that Miss Emily refuses to pay taxes, which you kind of have to unravel the sentences. I understand that the writing is not the easiest, but basically, what we're told is that Colonel Sartoris has invented a convoluted lie saying that Miss Emily's father had owned the town money, and this was their way of repaying it, that she wouldn't have to pay taxes. Um, and we get commentary on gender in this piece as well as on ethnicity. Um, and the fact that we're told only a woman could believe such a thing. But nevertheless, what happens is that the new generation comes into power. They want their taxes. Miss Emily refuses and tells them to go see Colonel Sartoris. Problem is, Colonel Sartoris has been dead for quite a while at this point. Again, illustrating how she lives in a dead past. And after finally Miss Emily passes, the entire town goes to her funeral, not because they respect her, but they think of her as a, quote, fallen monument, unquote. And they want to see the inside of her house, and which has been locked away for years. And when they go in there, they find a locked room. And when they enter the locked room, lo and behold, what do they find in the bed? Homer's corpse. And then in the second climax, just in the event that you had already anticipated the fact that Miss Emily had killed Homer and kept the body, much like she kept her father's body for 3 days, then we notice, and this is the last line, and the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair, which means that Miss Emily has been lying next to the corpse long after the corpse has decomposed because her hair turned gray long afterwards. This is actually a style of writing called Southern Gothic, and I teach a class actually in Gothic literature, which led to the creation of horror film, which started basically with stories written in England, starting in the late 1700s, going to the 1800s, and they established conventions such as death and decay and mysteries and possible supernatural events, lots of atmospheric elements. Think about Halloween, if you will, and how we celebrate Halloween by atmosphere. And you probably are familiar with some of these Gothic novels from the 1800s from England, Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And these are probably famous because of the movie adaptations that were done in the 1900s. And this tradition of Gothic that began in England moved to the United States when the United States was settled. Another author that you might be familiar with, or another text that you might be familiar with, are the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. He was an American, though he didn't necessarily set his stories in decrepit British castles, the way the old Gothic tales would have been told. And then there was a new set of authors who were commenting on the American South and its decay because of its sordid history with slavery. William Faulkner is one of those authors, writing in the Southern Gothic tradition. So it's supposed to be macabre, it's supposed to be unsettling, and if you think about possible rose imagery again, oftentimes roses are saved as mementos. They're dried and pressed. One could say that's what Miss Emily does with Homer, is that she basically saves him as a memento as well. But going on to the interview that I was not able to find online, the questioner asked Faulkner, it's been argued that a rose for Emily is a criticism of the North. And I personally can see how that could be, because perhaps it's a criticism of Homer Barron representing the North, who wouldn't commit to Emily. Or, the interviewer goes on, it could be argued that the story is a criticism of the South. And I can add that I could see that as well, that Miss Emily represents an old Southern aristocracy that no longer exists, that got its wealth and status off of the institution of slavery. And the reason why Miss Emily has been excused from paying her taxes is that while she still has the title of Miss Emily, she doesn't have the money, because the slave trade and the system of slavery that existed, that she was able to profit from, no longer is in place. And her house, which is falling apart, is very much a symbol of how the system is falling apart and she herself is falling apart. And she is described like a corpse at one point. In other words, even though her body is alive, she's dead in the sense that she's living in a dead past. She doesn't want things like newspaper, or I'm sorry, mail delivery or postage delivery. She doesn't want numbers put in her house, for instance. So the interviewer goes on and says, well, some say it's a criticism of the North and some say it's a criticism of the South. Could you say the story is a criticism of the times? And Faulkner says, well, I don't know. The writer was really writing about his environment. And I have to stop here and say that I love how he begins talking about himself in the third person, which strikes me as very odd. And I don't say that that's not valid in there, but it was no intention of the writer to say, let's see, I'm going to write a piece in which he was writing about the symbolism of the North and another symbol for the South, that he was simply writing about people, about the conflict of conscience of God and Satan. And the interviewer asked for a follow-up on that. What do you mean by God and Satan? Do you mean one represented the... And Faulkner says, no, the conflict was in Miss Emily. You knew you don't murder people. She had been trained, you don't take a lover, you marry. You don't take a lover. She had broken all the laws of her tradition, her background, and finally broken the law of God too. And then Faulkner ends by saying it's a ghost story, and I think it is a ghost story. Ghost stories are part of the Gothic tradition, but it doesn't have to be a supernatural ghost. Miss Emily's haunted by the past. And this is a very uncomfortable read. The N word is used, and it shows historically what was going on during the time. That's why I think it's important that the N word was used. Faulkner was very critical of the South. His family had come from the South and had benefited from slavery. So his writings are oftentimes a critique of that particular institution. He wrote the piece in 1931. The interview that I was talking to you about was not given until 1959. So a huge number of years have gone by. So whether it's the fact that Faulkner just didn't want to give answers as to what a rose for Emily might mean, he wanted us to struggle with it, or whether it's simply he just doesn't remember because so much time has elapsed, or whether or not he's being truthful and that he didn't necessarily have as many literary intentions as we've ascribed to him. It doesn't matter, because ultimately, as long as we can find evidence from the text to support a position, that position is valid, even if the author themselves disagrees. So I get back to the first question where he was asked, what is the meaning of the title A Rose for Emily? Where his response, I would say, is rather unsatisfying compared to all of the other possibilities that we could discuss in terms of symbolism of the text. But in terms of this particular text, I think one of the interesting things is, as I had said, language. And the language is not necessarily easy to dissect. And you'll remember that with the last piece that we were talking about, when we were discussing Story of an Hour, it highlighted some quotes. So that's going to be your attendance question for today, is to highlight a quote from A Rose for Emily and to indicate why you think that quote is important in the story. And my hope is that what we'll end up getting are a lot of different quotes. So by the time everybody in class responds, we'll have a good overview of some of the major elements of the story. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you're certainly encouraged to. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. So if you'll see the notes below, for A Rose for Emily, I had indicated the date. It was written in 1931, that the mixed chronology hides the ending. I talked a little bit about Southern Gothic and the author's interview. The notes below talk about possible rose imagery that we could think about. Some of the foreshadowing, the clues that we may not necessarily know are clues until we get to the ending of the story, so we might have to reread it. The family insanity, the domineering father, her denial of death. Notice she holds on to her father's corpse for 3 days, and 3 is a rather symbolic number from the Christian tradition of Trinity. The buying of the arsenic, and as I suggested, Homer might be a rat. His disappearance, the smell, and then her reclusive nature. And her living in that dead past of the old Southern aristocracy, of her holding on to her father and then Homer, of believing that she doesn't have to pay taxes even though Colonel Sartoris is gone. Her servant, which in the past would have been her slave, we don't hear from him at all in the story, and he disappears afterwards. What a fascinating story that would be to have his perspective and why he stays with her. Her refusal to get free postal delivery, the fact that she's trying to teach China painting, but no modern children of that society are interested in China painting. She even writes in calligraphy, so you'll see all these little signs there. Um, Most importantly, look at the narration and the story. It's told in the we. We learn more about about the community probably than we do about Miss Emily. It's told in the we so that we can see just how petty they are and how gossipy they are. And at one point, they think that Miss Emily is going to commit suicide, and instead of trying to intervene, after she buys the rat poison, they wait to see what's going to be happening. So we definitely get a sense of the fact that the community is being critiqued in this particular story. We'll never know Miss Emily's true story because we never get it from an objective observer. We get it from a community that basically is portrayed in a very negative light. It almost reminds me of modern day times where we tend to idolize celebrity, but we also take perhaps delight in their descent. And that happens in the story as well. In our next few classes, we'll talk about, and you can see this in the notes below in the third section, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. And I've included links for those that I've been able to find online. But again, our attendance question is ultimately about A Rose for Emily. Identify a quote in A Rose for Emily that you think is important and why it's important. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.